The poet wrote his own eulogy and died before the ink dried. Welcome to Marple Casebook. I am your host, Selwyn. Let's grow this mystery-loving circle. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Your thoughts always make this experience richer. Let's begin. The village of St. Mary Mead had seen its share of curious incidents, but none quite like the death of Leonard Wills, a poet of modest repute who had returned to his childhood home after years in London. His body was found slumped over his writing desk, an empty glass of brandy by his side. The room was locked from the inside, the key resting on the desk. A half-finished poem, ominous in its phrasing, lay before him as though he had foreseen his own demise. The words read, "By candles' glow, my final breath. In silence wrapped, I wait for death." The doctor, summoned by the housekeeper, declared it a straightforward case of heart failure. Leonard had no known enemies, no sign of struggle, and no visible wounds. The police, having little reason to suspect foul play, concluded it was natural causes, until the housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Emery, pointed out the peculiar absence of a candle. Leonard always wrote by candlelight, yet no stub, no melted wax, no holder was anywhere to be found. Miss Marple, ever observant, had heard the news over tea with Colonel Bantry and decided to pay her respects at once. The sight of Leonard's study, frozen in time since his death, struck her as deliberately arranged. The brandy glass had been placed too neatly, the inkpot too full for a man mid-composition. The absence of the candle was troubling, but so too was the poem itself. Was it a mere coincidence, or had Leonard truly anticipated his end? The police re-examined the body and found traces of digitalis, a poison derived from foxglove, a common enough plant in English gardens. The case was reopened as murder, but without an obvious suspect. Leonard's younger brother, Harold, had visited that evening but claimed he had left hours before. His housekeeper swore she had heard no disturbance, and the village had been quiet. There were no signs of forced entry, and with the door locked from within, it seemed impossible that anyone else could have administered the poison. Miss Marple, unhurried in her thoughts, asked after Leonard's acquaintances. A poet, especially one of middling success, often made both admirers and rivals. The vicar's wife mentioned a woman, Eleanor Stark, who had once been engaged to Leonard but had broken it off years ago. She had recently returned to the village, though what business she had with Leonard remained unclear. Harold, the brother, stood to inherit what little Leonard had, but he seemed genuinely grieved by the death. The more Miss Marple learned, the more the details seemed to resist cohesion. A locked room, an unfinished poem, a missing candle, and a poison that took time to act. If Leonard had drunk the poison himself, then why would he have written such a foreboding verse? If someone else had given it to him, how had they escaped unnoticed? The timeline did not quite fit, and the evidence felt just a touch too perfect. She visited Harold, who seemed eager to clear his name, and inquired about the poem. Harold admitted that Leonard had been fascinated with death, often toying with melancholic verses. "But this one," Harold muttered, shaking his head, "this wasn't finished. He always revised, always fussed over every line." The idea struck Miss Marple as significant. If Leonard had known he was dying, would he not have left something more final? The thought troubled her as she next visited Eleanor Stark, who greeted her coolly, but did not deny she had seen Leonard that day. "We had tea," Eleanor admitted. "I'd hoped to mend old wounds, but he was distant. We spoke of poetry, of regrets." She paused, glancing toward her bookshelf. He mentioned his latest work, something new, something unlike his usual style. A search of the study yielded no new manuscripts. If Leonard had indeed been writing something different, why had it vanished? Miss Marple's mind turned back to the missing candle. A candle was not just a source of light. It was also a means to destroy evidence. Returning once more to the scene, she examined the desk carefully. The surface, though tidy, bore a faint trace of soot, not from a fire in the hearth, but from something burned hurriedly. Leonard had been writing something he had chosen or been forced to destroy. It was then that she saw it, a single, faint fingerprint in the dried ink near the edge of the poem. Not Leonard's, for he was right-handed, and the smudge suggested a left-handed grip. Eleanor Stark was left-handed. Miss Marple studied the ink-smudged fingerprint, her keen gaze lingering on the page as she pieced together the implications. The police, content with their theories of an untraceable poisoner or a tragic accident, had overlooked this small but telling mark. Leonard Wills had been right-handed, yet this smudge suggested a left-handed writer had touched the page before the ink had dried. The thought of Eleanor Stark's careful, measured manner came to mind. But why would she tamper with the poem? And more importantly, what had been burned? Inspector Craddock, summoned from Scotland Yard after the discovery of poison, was polite but skeptical of Miss Marple's observations. He had examined Leonard's visitors, the grieving brother, the estranged fiancé, but neither had an obvious motive that stood up to scrutiny. Harold had little to gain financially, and Eleanor's presence in the village was, at most, an unfortunate coincidence. "Unless you suggest she kept a grudge for nearly 2 decades, Craddock remarked wryly, "I see no clear reason for her involvement." Miss Marple merely smiled, knowing human nature to be less about the obvious and more about the hidden wounds people carried. "It is not always a matter of grudge, Inspector," she mused. "Sometimes it is about unfinished business." Craddock humored her, allowing her to revisit the study while he pressed Harold for more details. The brandy glass, still sitting where it had been found, caught Miss Marple's attention once more. She lifted it, tilting it in the light. The residue at the bottom was faint, yet something about it struck her as peculiar. Carefully, she set it down and turned her attention to the writing desk. If Leonard had burned something, had he done so willingly, or had someone forced his hand? The fireplace had been swept clean, but Miss Marple was not one to dismiss small things. A soft brush over the grate yielded the faintest remnant of charred paper, barely enough to recognize, but enough to suggest it had been burned in haste. And there, at the very edge, a smudge of wax. So the candle had been here after all. But why remove it? She turned, peering at the bookshelf behind the desk. Eleanor had mentioned that Leonard had been working on something new. If it had not been found among his belongings, could it have been taken? Her fingers drifted along the spines of books, pausing when she noticed something odd. A thin layer of dust along most of the shelf, except for a distinct clean space where a book had recently been removed. It was not conclusive, but it was a hint that something had been taken after Leonard's death. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Craddock entered, frowning. "Harold insists his brother had no reason to take his own life, and yet the doctor is firm that digitalis would have taken some time to act. If it was in his brandy, then he drank it willingly." He crossed his arms. "Unless you suggest someone forced him?" Miss Marple's lips pursed in thought. Not forced, perhaps, but persuaded. Craddock eyed her warily. "And you believe Eleanor Stark had something to do with it?" "She was left-handed," Miss Marple said simply, gesturing to the fingerprint. "And something in this study is missing." The inspector exhaled. "If she took something, what do you think it was?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the desk. "Perhaps the truth." They visited Eleanor Stark later that afternoon. She received them with a practiced calm, though her eyes flickered slightly when Miss Marple mentioned Leonard's missing work. "A poet is always destroying drafts," Eleanor said smoothly. "He was never satisfied with anything he wrote." "Then why did you come to see him that evening?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor hesitated. "I wanted to apologize," she admitted, "for the past. We were young. It ended badly. Yet he invited you in. Yes, we talked for a while. Miss Marple tilted her head. And he showed you his latest work? Eleanor's lips parted slightly before she caught herself. He mentioned it. Craddock, watching her closely, spoke up. Miss Stark, did you take any of Leonard's belongings that night? Her reaction was subtle, but to Miss Marple's trained eye, it was revealing. A flicker of tension at her jaw, a hesitation just a beat too long. Eleanor shook her head. No. Miss Marple folded her hands. I see. They left soon after, but the way Eleanor had paused, the measured way she had answered, only confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Something had passed between them that night. Something Leonard had written. Something Eleanor had taken. And whatever it was, it had been important enough to kill for. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock walked in silence for a moment after leaving Eleanor Stark's cottage. The air was crisp, the late afternoon light casting long shadows over the village lane. It was the kind of silence that suggested thoughtfulness, not hesitation, and Miss Marple, ever perceptive, could sense the inspector turning over the details in his mind. She's lying, Craddock said at last. Oh, undoubtedly, Miss Marple agreed. But about what, precisely? That is the question. Craddock sighed, rubbing his temple. If she took something from Leonard's study, why not simply admit she saw him that night? A missing manuscript isn't a crime. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. That depends, my dear Inspector, on what it contained. They arrived back at Will's house, where Harold Wills was waiting for them in the sitting room. He looked up anxiously as they entered, his fingers tapping against the arm of his chair. The man had the nervous energy of someone who wished to be helpful but feared saying too much. "Inspector, Miss Marple," he greeted, forcing a smile. "Did you speak to Miss Stark?" "We did," Craddock confirmed, watching him closely. "She says she only visited briefly, to mend old wounds." Harold's expression flickered as though something about that explanation didn't sit right with him. "Did she?" Miss Marple took a seat opposite him. "Mr. Wills, when you last saw your brother, did he mention anything unusual? A visitor, perhaps, or something he was working on?" Harold hesitated. He was always working on something. He had a habit of carrying around a notebook, scribbling things down. His brow furrowed. "But when I went through his things, I didn't find it." Craddock straightened. "A notebook?" "Yes," Harold nodded. "He never let it out of his sight. If it's not here, then someone took it." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. A missing notebook, a missing manuscript. Both pointed to the same conclusion. Someone had taken Leonard's words, but for what reason? "Tell me, Mr. Wills," she continued gently. "How well did you know Eleanor Stark?" Harold gave a small, humorless laugh. "Not well at all. She and Leonard were engaged when I was just a boy. After they broke things off, I don't think they spoke again until recently." "And how did he feel about her return?" He hesitated again, weighing his words. "Uneasy, I suppose. She wrote to him before she came back. He showed me the letter." Craddock leaned forward. "You saw the letter?" Harold nodded. He crumpled it up and tossed it in the bin after reading it, but I smoothed it out. "She asked to meet, said she wanted to discuss unfinished business. I thought it was odd." Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes twinkled with understanding. "Oh, I imagine it was quite odd indeed." The next stop was the housekeeper, Mrs. Emery, a woman who had been in Leonard's service for the better part of a decade. She greeted them with a solemn nod and ushered them into the kitchen, setting out tea as though murder investigations were a routine part of the household schedule. "I knew something was wrong the moment I found him," she said gravely. "Mr. Leonard never left his desk in that state. And the candle, he always had a candle." Craddock nodded. "Mrs. Emery, did you see anyone unusual around the house that night?" She shook her head. "No, but I wasn't paying much attention, truth be told. I retire early, and Mr. Leonard often worked late. I didn't hear the front door, but that doesn't mean much." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Tell me, dear, Did Mr. Leonard receive many visitors? Mrs. Emery pursed her lips. Not many, no, but Miss Stark was here that evening. She arrived just before supper. I remember because I was bringing in the post. Craddock sat up straighter. You saw her? Yes. She was at the front step when I went out. And did you see her leave? The housekeeper frowned. No, but I assumed she did. I heard voices in the study, but I don't listen in on Mr. Leonard's affairs. Miss Marple gave a thoughtful hum. Quite right. And you say there was post that evening? A single letter. Do you know who it was from? Mrs. Emery hesitated. I do, actually. I couldn't help but notice the handwriting. It was from Mr. Howard. Craddock frowned. Howard. Howard Finch, Harold supplied. Leonard's publisher. A new thread had emerged. Miss Marple rose, smoothing out her skirt. Well now, that is most intriguing. Craddock wasted no time in sending for Howard Finch, who arrived the following morning. A thin, sharp-eyed man in a well-tailored suit, he had the look of someone who preferred efficiency over pleasantries. He took the news of Leonard's death with the air of a man assessing an unfortunate business loss rather than a personal tragedy. Terrible thing, he said briskly, settling into a chair. I can't imagine who would do such a thing. Miss Marple regarded him curiously. Mr. Finch, you wrote to Leonard the night he died. May I ask what it concerned? Finch gave a tight-lipped smile. A professional matter. Craddock's patience wore thin. Be specific. Finch sighed. Leonard submitted a manuscript to me, his best work yet. But there was something unusual about it. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Unusual in what way? Finch hesitated. It wasn't poetry. A long silence stretched between them. Craddock's brow furrowed, while Miss Marple remained perfectly still. Then what was it? She prompted gently. Finch exhaled. A memoir. Now things were coming into focus. Miss Marple folded her hands. And would this memoir, perhaps, have contained things that someone did not wish to be made public? Finch's lips thinned. I believe so, yes. It detailed something rather scandalous. Leonard seemed uneasy about publishing it. He asked me to hold on to it until he made up his mind. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And did you? No, Finch admitted. I sent it back to him a week ago. He told me he'd made a decision. He was going to let the world read it. A decision that had cost him his life. Miss Marple sat quietly as Finch's words settled in the air between them. A memoir, not poetry, not fiction, but something deeply personal, perhaps even dangerous. Leonard Wills had intended to share a truth he had long kept buried, and now he was dead. The timing was no coincidence. Inspector Craddock leaned forward, his voice edged with urgency. What exactly did this memoir contain, Mr. Finch? Finch hesitated, smoothing a hand over his knee. I only skimmed it before returning it to him. It was confessional, in a way, about his past, his regrets. But there was one part that stood out, something about a betrayal. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Betrayal? Finch nodded. Yes, but he didn't name names outright. He alluded to someone from his past, someone he once trusted, who had wronged him in a way that shaped the rest of his life. That was why he was so uncertain about publishing it. He knew it would stir up trouble. Craddock exhaled. And now he's dead. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly against the arm of her chair. Tell me, Mr. Finch, did Leonard express concern about how this person might react? Finch shifted uncomfortably. Not directly. But he did say, some ghosts should stay buried. I think he was afraid, but at the same time he wanted the truth to come out. That truth had been silenced before it could reach the world. And now, Miss Marple knew, the key to this case lay in uncovering what Leonard had tried to reveal. After Finch departed, Craddock wasted no time assembling what they now knew. Harold Wills, Eleanor Stark, And now, possibly, an unknown figure from Leonard's past. All had reasons to want his words buried, yet none of them accounted for every loose thread. "We still don't know what was burned in the fireplace," Craddock muttered, "or where his notebook is." Miss Marple gave a thoughtful hum. "I rather suspect the answers to both are closely tied." They decided to speak to Eleanor Stark again, this time with firmer resolve. She received them with the same careful poise, but there was a wariness in her gaze now, as if she sensed the walls closing in. "You've come again," she said, her voice steady. "Have you discovered something new?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Mr. Finch tells us that Leonard's latest work was not poetry, but a memoir." Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of her skirt. "I know nothing about that." "Don't you?" Craddock pressed. "You were in his study the night he died." Eleanor inhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "I won't deny that. I visited him, yes, but I left before midnight. I did not kill him." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Then tell me, dear, why did you take his notebook?" The reaction was brief, but it was there, a flicker of surprise before she composed herself. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple sighed. "I think you do. You see, Eleanor, Leonard had something to say about the past, and I rather think you knew what it was. Perhaps you wanted to stop him, or perhaps you were afraid of what it would mean for you." Eleanor's lips parted, then pressed together as though weighing her next words. "Leonard and we had history. I wanted to see him to make peace, but when I arrived, I found him in a state. He was agitated, talking about how the past had finally caught up with him." "And what did he mean by that?" Craddock asked sharply. Eleanor hesitated. "He didn't say, but he did show me something, a page from his notebook. He had written a name." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Whose name?" Eleanor swallowed. "Howard Finch." There was a long silence. Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Finch, the publisher?" Eleanor nodded. "I asked Leonard what it meant, but he wouldn't tell me. He only said that Finch had done something unforgivable." Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, sifting through the information. Finch had returned the manuscript, insisting he had no stake in Leonard's affairs, yet Leonard had written his name down, linking him to a betrayal. And now Leonard's words were missing. Craddock rose abruptly. "We need to have another word with Finch." But as they prepared to leave, Harold Wills arrived at Eleanor's door, his face pale and drawn. "I need to speak to you both," he said, his voice tight. "I found something in Leonard's things." Back at Will's house, Harold led them into the study, where he handed over a single sheet of crumpled paper. "I was going through his desk again and found this, hidden behind the bottom drawer." Miss Marple smoothed it out. The ink was smudged, but the words were clear. Howard Finch knew the truth. "He took everything from me." Craddock let out a sharp breath. "That's it, then. Finch had a reason to keep Leonard quiet." Harold frowned. "But what truth?" Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the page. A thought was forming, something elusive, yet insistent. She could feel the pieces shifting into place, the tangled motives beginning to sort themselves out. Finch had taken something from Leonard. But was it only words? Or was there something deeper, something far more dangerous, hidden within the past? Inspector Craddock wasted no time. Within the hour, Howard Finch was brought to the station for questioning. The publisher sat rigid in his chair, his hands folded neatly before him, his expression unreadable. He exuded the controlled composure of a man who had navigated many difficult conversations in his life and expected to navigate this one just the same. Craddock placed the crumpled note on the table between them. "Care to explain this, Mr. Finch?" Finch's eyes flickered to the paper, but his reaction was measured. "It looks like Leonard's handwriting." Craddock's voice sharpened. "It is Leonard's handwriting, and it accuses you of taking everything from him." Finch exhaled through his nose as if suppressing impatience. "And what exactly do you think that means, Inspector?" Miss Marple, sitting quietly beside Craddock, studied Finch's face. He wasn't nervous, but he was guarded, his careful wording revealing a man who had thought through his answers before he spoke them. "I should like to know that as well," she said gently. "What did Leonard mean when he wrote your name down?" Finch finally leaned back, his fingers tapping once against the tabletop. "If I had to guess, he was referring to an old dispute. Years ago, Leonard submitted a novel to me, a departure from his usual poetry. It was dreadful, I'm afraid. Unpublishable. But he was insistent, so I rejected it rather harshly. He never quite forgave me." Craddock frowned. "You expect us to believe that a simple rejection was enough for him to call you a thief?" Finch smiled humorlessly. "Artists can be dramatic, Inspector." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "And yet, Mr. Finch, we are not merely discussing artistic temperament. Leonard Wills is dead, and his final thoughts pointed to you." Finch exhaled. "You think I killed him? That's absurd. Why would I?" "Because of the memoir," Craddock said flatly. "He was about to publish something, wasn't he? Something that frightened you." Finch shook his head. "I told you. I sent it back to him. I didn't care what he did with it." Craddock wasn't convinced, but before he could push further, a constable knocked and entered with a quiet urgency. He leaned down and whispered something into the inspector's ear. Craddock's brows lifted. "Well, that's interesting," he murmured, straightening. "It appears we've found Leonard Wills's notebook." Miss Marple's head turned slightly. "Where?" Craddock's lips pressed together. "At Eleanor Stark's cottage." Finch gave a small, satisfied huff. "There you have it, Inspector. Perhaps you're questioning the wrong person." Eleanor Stark was brought in soon after, her face pale but her expression composed. The notebook lay on the desk between them, its black cover worn at the edges, the pages filled with Leonard's neat, precise handwriting. Craddock wasted no time. "Miss Stark, why was this found in your possession?" Eleanor glanced at the notebook, then met his gaze steadily. "Because I took it." There was a beat of silence. Craddock narrowed his eyes. "You admit it?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes. I took it from his study the night I visited him. He had left it on the desk, and when he turned away, She inhaled deeply. "I knew he was writing about the past, about us. I wanted to see for myself what he intended to say." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "And did you?" Eleanor hesitated. "I tried. But when I opened it, most of the pages had been torn out. There were only fragments left." Craddock frowned. "Torn out? By whom?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "But whatever Leonard had written, the most important parts, it was already missing before I took the notebook." Craddock exhaled sharply. "You realize this looks very bad for you, Miss Stark." "I realize that," Eleanor said quietly. "But I swear to you I didn't harm Leonard. I wanted answers, that's all." Miss Marple studied her carefully. There was sincerity in her voice, but beyond that, something else. A quiet sadness, perhaps even guilt. Not guilt of murder, but of something else entirely. Craddock sighed and turned to Miss Marple. "The pieces fit, don't they? She was at the house. She took the notebook, and she clearly had something to hide." Finch, who had been watching with detached interest, gave a small nod. "It does seem rather clear-cut." Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. She tapped a delicate finger against the tabletop, deep in thought. Then finally she looked up. "No," she said simply. Craddock blinked. "No?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's too simple." Finch frowned. "How do you mean?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Leonard's death was calculated. His final work was taken, burned. And yet a crucial piece of evidence, his notebook, is conveniently found at Miss Stark's cottage." She shook her head. That is not a mistake the true culprit would make. Craddock considered this. You're saying it was planted? Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. Eleanor Stark may have taken the notebook, but she did not kill Leonard. The real culprit still lurks in the shadows. A silence stretched across the room. Finch's expression remained carefully neutral, while Eleanor swallowed, relief flickering briefly across her face. Craddock let out a slow breath. Then we're back where we started. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, not quite, dear Inspector. We are very close. The puzzle is nearly complete. We need only to place the final piece. Miss Marple sat quietly in the dimly lit study, her delicate fingers resting on the spine of Leonard Wills's battered notebook. Though the most damning pages were gone, something about the remaining fragments called to her, whispering a truth just beyond reach. She had learned over years of quiet observation that human nature was predictable. People rarely acted without reason, and murder was never committed in isolation. It was always the product of something deeper, something older. Craddock paced near the fireplace, his jaw set in frustration. So if Eleanor Stark didn't kill him, and if Finch had no interest in the manuscript beyond business, then what are we left with? Harold Wills? He gains nothing from Leonard's death. Miss Marple glanced up. Oh, but that isn't entirely true, is it? He gains freedom from a past he might prefer to forget. Craddock frowned. The past? She tapped the notebook lightly. This isn't about poetry, or even publishing. It's about something Leonard Wills was ready to confess, and I believe that confession was tied to something that happened long before this murder. Harold Wills, when summoned back, looked wary. He had grown more unsettled as the investigation stretched on, his initial confidence giving way to something more fragile. "What more do you want from me?" he asked, his voice tight. "I've answered every question." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "I think, dear, that you've answered every question in the way you wish them to be heard. But there is a difference between speaking and telling the truth." Harold's lips pressed together. "I don't know what you mean." She smiled faintly. "Tell me, Mr. Wills, how did your brother and Howard Finch first meet?" Harold blinked. "Through publishing, I imagine." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, that's what we were meant to believe. But Leonard's note was clear. He had known Finch for much longer." Craddock crossed his arms. "What are you getting at, Miss Marple?" She turned her gaze toward Finch. "Mr. Finch, you've been quite careful in your responses, but I suspect you've been economical with the truth. You said Leonard submitted a novel to you years ago. What was it about?" Finch hesitated. "I don't recall." "Oh, but you do," she said gently. "Because I believe that novel wasn't fiction at all." A beat of silence passed before Finch exhaled sharply. "It was about a school." Harold's expression darkened. "That's ridiculous." Craddock's interest piqued. "A school?" Finch nodded stiffly. "A boarding school Leonard and I attended as boys. It was a bleak place, overcrowded, understaffed, the kind where cruelty festered." His voice tightened. "Leonard wrote about it, but it wasn't a story. It was a confession. And an accusation." Harold stood abruptly. "This is nonsense. You're dredging up things that have no relevance." Miss Marple remained unshaken. "Oh, but I think it is relevant, Mr. Wills, because this past that you wish to forget is precisely what Leonard was going to reveal." Craddock's voice grew hard. "What was in the book, Finch?" Finch hesitated, then sighed. "It was about a boy who suffered at the hands of a cruel housemaster. Leonard knew what was happening, but was too afraid to stop it. Later, he tried to make amends by writing the truth, but no one would publish it. He carried that guilt for years." Miss Marple turned to Harold. "And that housemaster? He had a name, didn't he?" Harold's face had gone pale. His lips parted, then closed. Miss Marple's voice softened. "It was your father, wasn't it?" Silence settled heavily over the room. Harold's hands trembled slightly at his sides. "My father was a good man," he said, but the words lacked conviction. He taught discipline, order. Miss Marple's gaze was kind but unyielding. And fear. Finch exhaled. Leonard was haunted by what he saw. He knew what your father did, Harold, and he finally decided to put it in writing. Craddock took a step forward. That's why you killed him, isn't it? You knew if the truth came out, it would stain everything, your family name, your career, everything you'd built. Harold let out a low, bitter laugh. You don't understand. My whole life I lived in that shadow. My father's legacy was strict, unyielding, but I convinced myself it was righteous. And then Leonard, he was going to ruin it all. With one book, he would take everything. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. So you silenced him. Harold's jaw clenched. I didn't mean to. I only wanted him to stop. To listen. He looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. But he wouldn't. A long silence filled the room before Craddock finally spoke. Harold Wills, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Leonard Wills. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly as the constables moved in. The past, long buried, had finally reached the light. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap as Harold Wills was led away. The confession had come as no great surprise, yet there remained a lingering discomfort. Something about it had settled too easily, too neatly into place. Inspector Craddock, pacing beside her, seemed to sense it as well. He cast her a sidelong glance. Well, we have our man, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Do we? Craddock stopped, his brow furrowing. He confessed. Indeed he did. But confessions are curious things, Inspector. They can be born of guilt, of desperation, of misplaced responsibility. She tilted her head slightly. Did Harold Wills strike you as a man capable of carrying out such a meticulous crime? Craddock hesitated. He had motive. Oh, certainly. But motive alone does not make a murderer. The precision of this crime, the burning of the manuscript, the placement of the notebook at Eleanor Stark's home, those were the actions of someone methodical, calculated. She tapped a delicate finger against the arm of her chair. Harold Wills is a man of impulse. I do not believe he is the architect of this tragedy. Craddock exhaled sharply. So you think he's covering for someone? Miss Marple's expression did not change, but there was a quiet certainty in her voice. I think Harold Wills believes he's guilty, but I think there is another, far cleverer mind at work. Craddock ran a hand through his hair. Then how do we shake the real culprit loose? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. We let them believe they have already won. The following morning, the announcement of Harold Wills's arrest was deliberately leaked to the press. The town, ever eager for scandal, was abuzz with whispers of the fallen brother, the family disgrace. Miss Marple, meanwhile, set about making a series of seemingly idle visits. To Eleanor Stark, to Howard Finch, even to a few shopkeepers who had known Leonard Wills in passing. Each conversation was pleasant, unassuming, and yet with every interaction, she observed. By afternoon, she had arranged a small gathering at the very place where it had all begun, Leonard Wills' home. Finch arrived first, his expression carefully neutral, followed by Eleanor Stark, who looked weary but composed. A few moments later, Harold Wills was brought in under supervision. Though his posture remained rigid, there was a flicker of something in his gaze. Uncertainty, perhaps. Miss Marple smiled gently. I do apologize for the inconvenience, but I felt it only fair to let you all hear the final truth together. She turned to Craddock, who stood with his arms crossed, watching. Would you be so kind as to read aloud the remaining pages of Leonard's notebook? Craddock hesitated, then picked up the worn journal. There's not much left, he said. Ah, but there is enough, Miss Marple said pleasantly. Clearing his throat, Craddock read, Memory is a strange thing. It sharpens with regret, I once knew a boy who learned to hide in plain sight. He was clever, so very clever, and he thought himself safe. But the past never forgets, and now neither shall I." Silence fell over the room. Sir Finch chuckled dryly. Poetic, but hardly illuminating. Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward him. "Ah, but I think it is very illuminating, Mr. Finch. You see, Leonard Wills did not write those words about his brother, nor did he write them about himself. A subtle shift, barely perceptible, but there nonetheless." Finch's hand twitched at his side, a brief tightening of his jaw. Miss Marple's voice remained light. "I have spent the morning speaking to those who knew Leonard Wills. He was a private man, but not unkind. He was, however, quite determined when he set his mind to something. And I believe he set his mind to exposing a very old secret, one that someone could not afford to have revealed." She turned to Finch. "You said Leonard submitted a novel to you that was unpublishable. But that was not the first time he had tried, was it? Years ago, he came to you with the truth, and you turned him away." Finch's expression did not change. "You're making quite a lot of assumptions, Miss Marple." She smiled pleasantly. "Ah, but I am so very fond of assumptions. They often lead to the most remarkable truths." Finch exhaled, shaking his head. "Even if that were true, it doesn't mean I killed him." "Oh, no," Miss Marple agreed, "but I do believe you destroyed his manuscript. You made certain that whatever Leonard intended to reveal was erased before it could ever come to light." She turned to Eleanor. "And yet, even after it was burned, Leonard continued writing, didn't he? In secret, in fragments." Eleanor's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued. "And then, dear Mr. Finch, you faced a rather terrible problem. Leonard had seen you for what you were, and he had found a way to document it. The pages may be gone, but the words remained in his mind. And so you arranged for his silence." Finch exhaled sharply. "This is absurd." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Ah, but you see, there is one rather inconvenient detail." She turned to Harold Wills. "You said you only wanted Leonard to stop, that you didn't mean for things to go so far. That was the truth, wasn't it?" Harold hesitated. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And yet the poison that killed your brother was not something you had access to." Finch stiffened. Miss Marple turned back to him. "But you did, Mr. Finch. You who had been so very careful all these years. You who had spent a lifetime hiding in plain sight." Silence stretched between them. Then Finch exhaled and smiled, slowly, bitterly. "I should have known you would see it." Craddock stepped forward. "So you admit it?" Finch chuckled. "Why not? Leonard should have kept his nose out of the past. He should have let things be." He looked at Miss Marple with something almost like admiration. "But you, well, I imagine you never let anything be, do you?" Miss Marple's smile was kind. "No, dear, I don't." As the constables moved in to take Finch away, Miss Marple sat back, hands folded neatly in her lap. The past had finally spoken, and for once it had not been ignored. Miss Marple remained seated as the constables led Howard Finch away. The air in the room still hummed with the weight of revelation, but something unsettled her. The confession had been delivered, yet it had come too easily. Finch, despite his intelligence, had barely resisted. There had been no desperate attempts at deception, no last-minute scrambling to deny the truth. Instead, there had been almost an air of resignation, even amusement. That, she thought, was most troubling of all. Inspector Craddock, still standing beside her, let out a long breath. "Well, that's that, then." Miss Marple's hands remained folded in her lap. "Perhaps." Craddock frowned. "You still have doubts?" She tilted her head slightly. "Only that I do not believe Mr. Finch is a man who leaves things to chance." The inspector sighed. "If you're suggesting there's more to it, I'd like to see proof." Miss Marple offered a small, knowing smile. Then I do believe we should check on the proof we already have. By the time they arrived at the station, the sky had darkened, the village settling into an evening hush. Craddock led the way through the corridors, his steps brisk. They entered the evidence room, where everything related to Leonard Will's murder had been carefully catalogued. The few remaining pages of his notebook, the ink-stained handkerchief found near the fireplace, the charred remnants of paper from the hearth. But as the constable unlocked the cabinet and pulled open the designated drawer, Craddock's expression turned to stone. It was empty. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag. Craddock spun toward the constable. "Where are the items from the Wills case?" The young officer looked just as bewildered. "They were here this afternoon, sir." Craddock's jaw set. "Then someone has been very busy since." Miss Marple's voice remained even. Perhaps Mr. Finch was not so resigned after all. Craddock cursed under his breath and turned on his heel. "We need to search the station now, if the evidence is still on the premises." But Miss Marple held up a hand. "Inspector, may I make a suggestion?" He exhaled sharply, but he knew better than to ignore her. "Go on." Her gaze remained thoughtful. A man like Howard Finch would not have risked removing the evidence himself. Even the most cunning of criminals must rely on help. She glanced at the constable still standing there, his face pale. "Which means, Inspector, that you may have a rat in your walls." Craddock stiffened. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I do not believe the evidence is simply missing. I believe it has been taken with purpose, and that purpose is to ensure Mr. Finch's secrets remain buried." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Then we need to find out who's working with him." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. But first, we must find out exactly what has been taken, and what, perhaps, they might have overlooked." The station was turned upside down within the hour. Desks were searched, drawers unlocked, waste bins emptied. But there was no sign of the missing evidence. A growing tension filled the air as the realization set in. Whoever had taken it had done so cleanly. Miss Marple, however, remained seated in the inspector's office, deep in thought. "It is a terrible thing," she murmured, "to be afraid of the past. Mr. Finch believed himself safe for so long, but fear has a way of making itself known. The question is, who else shared in that fear?" Craddock sank into his chair, rubbing his forehead. "If Finch had an accomplice, we have to figure out who it is." Miss Marple's gaze was distant. "Someone with access to the evidence, someone who knew precisely what to take. And yet the question remains, what did they fear would be found?" Craddock exhaled sharply. "We don't even know what's missing. The notebook, the burned pages." "The ink-stained handkerchief," Miss Marple said quietly. Craddock frowned. "You think that was important?" Miss Marple's hands folded neatly in her lap. "My dear Inspector, I think it was everything." Craddock stared at her for a moment before cursing again and pushing himself to his feet. "We need to re-examine every person who had access to that evidence room." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her voice softened. "And we must ask ourselves, who stands to lose the most if the truth comes to light?" Outside the station, the village lay quiet, unaware that within its peaceful streets, a desperate game was still being played. A heavy silence hung over the station, thick with unease. Inspector Craddock paced in short, sharp movements, his frustration evident. The missing evidence had changed everything. It was no longer just a matter of proving Howard Finch's guilt. It was now a race against an unseen hand, determined to erase the truth before it could surface. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner, her knitting needles resting motionless in her lap, her expression pensive. A constable entered the room hesitantly, clearing his throat. "Sir, there's been an incident." Craddock turned sharply. "What kind of incident?" The constable swallowed. "Dr. Evelyn Radcliffe is dead." The room seemed to shrink around them. Craddock's face hardened and Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her knitting. "Where?" Craddock asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Her house, sir. The maid found her not half an hour ago." Craddock grabbed his coat. "We leave immediately." Miss Marple rose as well, her face unreadable. "Inspector, if I may accompany you—" Craddock nodded, not even questioning it. They arrived at Dr. Radcliffe's house to find the scene disturbingly quiet. The maid, a trembling young woman, let them in with red-rimmed eyes, barely able to answer questions. In the sitting room, Dr. Radcliffe lay slumped in her chair, a glass overturned at her feet, its dark contents staining the rug. A faint, acrid scent still lingered in the air. Craddock crouched beside her, his eyes sweeping the scene. "Poison," he muttered grimly. No sign of struggle. Miss Marple observed the woman's still form with quiet sorrow. And yet she was healthy when I saw her only yesterday. This was no accident. Craddock stood, his fists clenching. Someone killed her to keep her silent. She must have known something. Miss Marple glanced at the overturned glass. Or someone wanted us to think she did. The inspector turned to the maid. "Who was the last person to see her?" The girl sniffled. I was out most of the afternoon, but when I came back I heard voices. Someone was here." Craddock's expression sharpened. "A man or a woman?" "I don't know, I only heard murmurs." But she sounded upset. Miss Marple moved carefully around the room, her eyes catching small details. A book left open, a drawer slightly ajar. But it was when she reached the side table that she paused. The dust had been disturbed, as if something had been recently removed. She turned to the maid. "Did Dr. Radcliffe keep anything here? Letters, perhaps?" The girl hesitated. "She used to... Yes, she kept some papers in a little wooden box, but..." Her eyes widened. "It's gone." Craddock cursed under his breath. First the missing evidence, now this. Someone is tying up loose ends. Miss Marple's expression was distant, or perhaps untying them. Craddock frowned. "What do you mean?" She touched the armrest of the chair where Dr. Radcliffe sat. "I fear we have been thinking of this crime too simply. We assumed Howard Finch was the mastermind. But what if he was only a piece of the puzzle?" Craddock's face darkened. "You think there's someone else behind this?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "I think there always was." A creak sounded from the hallway. Craddock turned sharply, his hand reaching for his revolver, but the maid let out a soft gasp. "That wasn't me." Miss Marple's eyes lifted toward the doorway. The air in the house had changed. Someone else was there. Craddock's fingers curled around the handle of his revolver, his stance rigid as he took a step toward the doorway. The house was silent except for the faint creaking of the old floorboards beneath his feet. Miss Marple, still standing by Dr. Radcliffe's chair, observed the shifting air with quiet alertness. There was no rush to her movements, only a deep, knowing patience. A shadow flickered just beyond the dimly lit hallway. Then, suddenly, the sound of hurried steps, light, quick, vanishing toward the back of the house. Craddock sprang forward, tearing through the corridor. The back door stood ajar, swaying gently as a cool breeze whispered through the frame. He burst into the garden, eyes darting over the moonlit hedges, the rustling leaves, the darkness beyond. Nothing. Whoever had been there was already gone. Miss Marple appeared beside him, her composure undisturbed. "They were not here to harm us, Inspector. They were searching for something." Craddock muttered a curse. "And they got away with it." Miss Marple's gaze drifted upward, taking in the old house. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they left us something instead." They returned to the sitting room, where the maid still trembled near the fireplace. Craddock cast an impatient glance around the room before letting out a breath of frustration. "We've got nothing. Radcliffe's dead. The missing papers are still missing. And now we've got someone sneaking about in the dark? Miss Marple's fingers skimmed over the table where the wooden box had been. Her voice remained thoughtful. Not nothing, Inspector. We have something quite important. Craddock looked at her expectantly, but she didn't elaborate immediately. Instead, she moved toward the chair where Dr. Radcliffe's body rested. Carefully, she picked up the book the doctor had been reading before her death. Her fingers traced the edge of the page, still marked by a pressed violet. She turned it toward the inspector. Do you see what she was reading? Craddock squinted. A book of poetry. What of it? Miss Marple's lips pursed. But not just any poetry. This is Leonard Will's own work. Craddock straightened. You think she was reading it before she died? Miss Marple nodded. And she left a mark on this particular page, not by accident, I believe. The poem was brief, no more than a handful of lines. In ink and ash, the story's told, a name in fire, a hand grown cold. What's lost in flame still leaves a trace, a hidden truth, a dark embrace. Craddock exhaled slowly. You think this means something? Miss Marple closed the book gently. I think Dr. Radcliffe believed it did, and someone else feared she was right. A thought began to form in her mind, an idea that had been flickering at the edges for some time now. The missing evidence, the fire in Leonard Will's home, the burned fragments. Someone had been trying to erase something, but, as the poem suggested, fire did not erase all. She turned to the maid. Did Dr. Radcliffe mention Leonard Wills often? The girl hesitated. Not often, miss, but she did say something strange once. She said he was a man who never forgot his own words. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something clicked into place. A memory, an old habit, something Wills himself had once said in passing at a garden party years ago. A poet's words are his fingerprints. If you wish to know him, follow the ink. The ink. She turned back to Craddock. Inspector, we have been thinking of this all wrong. Leonard Wills did not simply leave behind a notebook. He left behind a message. Craddock frowned. But the notebook was destroyed. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Not entirely. The ink-stained handkerchief, Inspector. That was not just a discarded piece of cloth. It was the one thing that survived the fire. Craddock's mouth opened slightly. Miss Marple clasped her hands. If Leonard Wills knew he was in danger, he may have hidden something within his own words, and if that ink contains the final truth, then someone has gone to great lengths to ensure it is never read. Craddock's mind worked rapidly, following her logic. Then the missing evidence, the handkerchief. It's the key to everything. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Inspector, and now we must find it before the true culprit ensures we never do. Miss Marple sat in quiet contemplation, the faint ticking of the mantel clock filling the room. Craddock paced near the window, his frustration evident. The handkerchief had vanished. Someone had taken it, likely the same person who had crept through the house earlier. But why? The ink held significance, that much was certain. And yet something still didn't sit right. The pattern was clear, the threads connected, but the full picture remained just out of reach. Miss Marple's eyes settled on the book of poetry in her lap. The words echoed in her mind. A hidden truth, a dark embrace. The ink, she murmured. Inspector, we must reconsider the nature of what we are looking for. It is not just a message. It is a confession. Craddock turned sharply. A confession? You think Wills was trying to tell us who was after him? Miss Marple nodded. Not only who, but why. And I fear the answer is more complicated than simple revenge. The maid, still lingering hesitantly near the door, wrung her hands. Begging your pardon, miss, but Dr. Radcliffe, she wasn't just interested in Mr. Wills's poems. She spoke of him often in connection to a very old case. Craddock's brow furrowed. An old case? What do you mean? The girl hesitated, as if afraid she had already said too much. I don't know all the details, sir. just that she once mentioned Mr. Wills had been close to someone years ago, before his writing became famous. Someone who died under unusual circumstances. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the book. Not his wife. The maid shook her head. No, miss. Before her. A woman who drowned, I think. Dr. Radcliffe said it had always been an open question whether it was an accident or not. Craddock's expression darkened. And she was investigating it. The girl gave a small nod. Not formally, sir. Just reading old papers, asking questions. She said something about how time never buries the truth. Not really. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment. Then I believe we have been mistaken about the nature of this crime. This was never just about Leonard Will's murder. Craddock waited, tension hanging in the air. Miss Marple finally spoke. The true motive does not lie in the present. It lies in the past. Someone was afraid that Dr. Radcliffe would uncover the truth about that old drowning, perhaps even prove it was no accident at all. The inspector exhaled, the weight of realization settling over him. You're saying this wasn't about silencing Wills. It was about stopping Radcliffe before she found something. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Inspector. And I believe that something is written in Will's ink. He must have known the truth and left behind a record of it. If Dr. Radcliffe had deciphered it, she would have revealed everything. Craddock rubbed a hand over his face. So whoever killed her, Miss Marple finished for him, wasn't acting out of greed or simple revenge. They were protecting a secret that had been buried for decades, a secret worth killing for. There was a long silence. Then, with quiet certainty, Miss Marple rose. Inspector, we must recover that handkerchief before the past is buried for good. Miss Marple sat with her hands neatly folded in her lap, the firelight flickering over her serene expression. Across from her, in the grand sitting room of Greystone Manor, the tension in the air was almost tangible. The small gathering of suspects, Mrs. Wills, Dr. Radcliffe's assistant Mr. Pettigrew, young Miss Collins, and, of course, Colonel Braithwaite, sat rigid in their seats, their gazes flickering between each other, waiting for what was to come. Inspector Craddock stood near the door, his arms crossed, watching with measured patience as Miss Marple prepared to speak. She let the silence stretch just long enough to allow unease to settle before she finally began, her voice soft but clear. I've spent much time considering this case, and it is one of the more tragic ones I have encountered, not merely because of the deaths themselves, but because of what lay at the heart of them. She glanced down at the book of poetry in her lap, running a gentle hand over the worn cover. A crime of such complexity is rarely born from greed or impulse alone. This, I fear, was something else entirely. A secret buried in time which has now forced its way to the surface. Mrs. Wills shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fingers tightening around the handkerchief in her lap. Mr. Pettigrew, usually composed, swallowed hard. Craddock's voice cut through the silence. We found the missing handkerchief. He let the words hang, allowing them to settle before continuing. Or, should I say, what was left of it. Someone went through great trouble to destroy it, but not before we were able to recover traces of the ink. Enough to read what Mr. Wills had written. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. And what we found, of course, told us everything. You see, Mr. Wills had been haunted by an event from long ago, the drowning of a woman he once loved. A woman who did not die by accident, as many believed. No, she was silenced, just as Dr. Radcliffe was silenced when she began to uncover the truth. Miss Collins let out a small, involuntary gasp, covering her mouth with her hand. Mrs. Wills's breathing had quickened, her eyes darting from Miss Marple to Craddock, as if calculating whether escape was possible. Miss Marple exhaled softly, the weight of what she was about to say heavy, even for her. It was you, wasn't it, Mrs. Wills? The room seemed to contract around them. Mrs. Wills's grip on her handkerchief was so tight her knuckles turned white. Her lips parted as though to protest, but Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but firm. "You loved him, even then, before he became famous, before he married you. But there was another, someone he loved first, and she was in the way, wasn't she?" Mrs. Wills's face had lost all color. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "So you rid yourself of her, a drowning that appeared an accident, a tragedy that no one questioned too deeply. And Mr. Wills, poor man, must have suspected, perhaps even known, but he never spoke of it. Not until, all these years later, the past came knocking once more." A deep, rattling breath escaped Mrs. Wills's lips. She turned her gaze downward, her whole body trembling. "You had no choice," Miss Marple continued gently. "Not when Dr. Radcliffe came asking questions. Not when you realized she was on the verge of uncovering everything. You silenced her before she could reveal the truth, just as you silenced that poor woman all those years ago." Inspector Craddock took a step forward, readying himself for what might come next. But Mrs. Wills did not run. She simply sat there, the truth pressing down upon her with the unbearable weight of time. Then, slowly, her lips parted, and she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did it for him," she said. "I did it all for him." Miss Marple's expression softened, but there was no triumph in her gaze, only sorrow. Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit drawing-room, her hands resting lightly on the poetry book that had been at the heart of the mystery. The room had grown unbearably still after Mrs. Wills's whispered confession, the weight of her words settling over the assembled group like an oppressive fog. Inspector Craddock stood at the edge of the room, his eyes trained on the woman who had just admitted to murder. Everything seemed resolved, the case neatly tied together, and yet Miss Marple remained silent, her gaze lingering on Mrs. Wills, then drifting slowly toward the others. It was a peculiar thing, the way Mr. Pettigrew had remained so still, his fingers laced tightly together in his lap. The way Miss Collins' breath had hitched slightly at Mrs. Wills's confession, though she had quickly masked it with a delicate clearing of her throat. And Colonel Braithwaite, his usual bluster had quieted to an unnatural calm, his hands pressed firmly against his thighs as if he were forcing himself not to move. Something still wasn't right. Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly, her sharp blue eyes fixing on the elderly colonel. "You seem remarkably composed, Colonel. I should think, after everything, you would have something to say." Braithwaite met her gaze with the cool confidence of a man used to command. "What is there to say? A tragic business, but it seems we have our culprit." Miss Marple let the silence stretch between them, then turned to Mrs. Wills, who had slumped back in her chair, staring blankly at the carpet. "It is a tragic business indeed. And yet there is something that troubles me, my dear." She set the book down carefully beside her. "Your confession came so quickly, so easily. I do not doubt that you were involved, but I must ask, why now? Why, after all these years, did you decide to act?" Mrs. Wills's breath shuddered slightly, but she didn't speak. It was Craddock who answered. "Because Dr. Radcliffe started asking questions," he said, stepping forward. "She was closing in on the truth." Miss Marple nodded, but her gaze did not leave Mrs. Wills. "Yes, but was she really? Or was she meant to appear that way?" The room shifted imperceptibly, the weight of her words unsettling the stillness. Mr. Pettigrew let out a nervous cough. Miss Collins turned her face away, staring at the fire as though it might provide answers, and Colonel Braithwaite remained utterly still. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unwavering. "The truth is, Mrs. Wills, you are meant to believe that Dr. Radcliffe knew too much. Someone led you to that conclusion, didn't they?" Mrs. Wills's brows furrowed slightly, her lips parting. You were manipulated." The words landed with a quiet finality. A new kind of silence filled the room, not the heavy silence of resolution, but something sharper, more uncertain. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward Mr. Pettigrew, who had gone an alarming shade of pale. A rather elaborate scheme, wasn't it, Mr. Pettigrew? You played it beautifully, pushing Mrs. Wills toward her confession, nudging her just enough to take the fall. Pettigrew's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Craddock frowned. Miss Marple, what are you saying? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression one of mild regret. I'm saying that Mrs. Wills did indeed kill Dr. Radcliffe, but she did not do so because she uncovered the truth about the past. She did so because someone made her believe she had no choice, and that someone is in this room. A small gasp escaped Miss Collins. Braithwaite's fingers twitched against his knees. Pettigrew looked utterly stricken. Miss Marple continued, her voice as calm as ever. Mr. Pettigrew, you were always close to Dr. Radcliffe, weren't you? A devoted assistant, a trusted colleague. And yet there were small things that didn't quite fit. The way you described her work, for instance, so certain she was on the verge of exposing something. She smiled faintly. And yet, as we now know, she was not. Dr. Radcliffe was not investigating a decades-old crime. You only made it seem that way. Pettigrew let out a shaky breath. That's absurd. Miss Marple shook her head. Oh no, not at all. You see, Mrs. Wills was an easy target. A woman living under the weight of a terrible secret, fearful that one day it might come to light. And so you fed that fear, didn't you? You placed just enough doubt in her. Mind, hinted at just enough discoveries. You led her to believe that Dr. Radcliffe knew the truth, when, in fact, she knew nothing at all. Mrs. Wills let out a soft, shuddering sob. Pettigrew's hands trembled slightly in his lap, but it was Braithwaite whom Miss Marple watched most closely, the way his jaw had tightened, the way he had leaned ever so slightly forward. Craddock turned to Pettigrew. Is this true? Pettigrew hesitated, just a fraction too long. But Miss Marple wasn't finished. Her voice, still gentle, turned toward the man who had remained so carefully composed. And yet, I wonder, was Pettigrew working alone? For the first time, Braithwaite's carefully constructed mask slipped. Miss Marple's tone remained even. It was you, wasn't it, Colonel? You and Pettigrew together. A convenient plan, was it not? Let Mrs. Wills take the blame. Let her past sins condemn her. After all, who would question a woman with such a secret? She tilted her head slightly. But I suspect the true reason for Dr. Radcliffe's murder had nothing to do with the past. It had everything to do with the present. Braithwaite's mouth was a thin, grim line. Craddock took a step forward. Colonel, do you deny it? Silence. Then, ever so slowly, Braithwaite exhaled. His shoulders relaxed, the tension that had been holding him upright finally breaking. When he spoke, his voice was eerily calm. You're very clever, Miss Marple. He gave her a small, almost approving nod. Too clever by half. Pettigrew's breath hitched, his face now a sickly shade of gray. Braithwaite stood, his movements deliberate, calculated. And yet, I imagine you have no proof. Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, I think you'll find we do. She glanced toward Craddock. I believe the good inspector will be quite interested in the financial records of Dr. Radcliffe's research grant. A rather unfortunate discrepancy, isn't there? Braithwaite's lips parted slightly, the briefest flicker of surprise crossing his face before he regained his composure. Craddock nodded grimly. We checked. Large sums unaccounted for. Money funneled into accounts connected to you, Colonel. Dr. Radcliffe must have suspected. Braithwaite let out a short, humorless laugh. Well then, I suppose that's that. Pettigrew looked as though he might be sick. Miss Marple simply nodded. Yes, she said softly. I suppose it is. Miss Marple sat quietly, her delicate hands folded over the poetry book that had unraveled the entire case. Around her, the air hung thick with the weight of exposed truths. Colonel Braithwaite remained standing, his expression unreadable, while Pettigrew had all but collapsed in his chair, his face a ghastly shade of pale. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his jaw set. "So," Craddock said, his voice carefully measured, "you and Pettigrew orchestrated the entire thing. You funneled the money, made sure Dr. Radcliffe suspected just enough to be dangerous, and when she became a threat, you had her silenced. But instead of doing it yourselves, you used Mrs. Wills." Braithwaite let out a slow, deliberate breath. His mouth curved ever so slightly. "Clever, Inspector. But I assume you have evidence beyond mere theory." Miss Marple's smile remained gentle, though her eyes were sharp. "Oh, I believe we do." Pettigrew let out a soft whimper. His trembling hands clenched the edge of his chair as if trying to ground himself. "You told me," his voice cracked. "You told me it wouldn't come to this." Braithwaite's gaze flicked toward him, a brief glance of something almost like disdain. "You should have been stronger, Pettigrew." Miss Marple sighed softly. "It's always the way, isn't it? One mastermind, one follower, and yet the follower is always the first to break." Her eyes returned to Pettigrew. "I suspect it was you who planted the notes from Mrs. Wills, wasn't it? The small cryptic messages, the hints that made her believe Dr. Radcliffe had uncovered everything. You fed her fear until it consumed her, until she truly believed she had no other option." Pettigrew's breath came in short, panicked bursts. I never meant for her to—" Braithwaite's voice was cold. "You knew exactly what you were doing." Inspector Craddock's patience snapped. "Enough of this." He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his coat, stepping toward Braithwaite. "You're under arrest, Colonel." For a moment, the air seemed to shift. Braithwaite straightened, his face impassive, but there was something else, something lurking beneath the surface. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I don't think so, Inspector." And then he moved. It was a swift, trained motion, his hand darting inside his jacket. Craddock lunged, reaching for him, but Braithwaite was faster. A glint of metal, the snap of something releasing. Miss Marple's voice cut through the chaos, firm despite its quietness. "I wouldn't, Colonel." Braithwaite froze. The small pistol in his hand remained motionless, caught halfway between defiance and resignation. And yet it was not Craddock's authority that had stopped him. It was Miss Marple's unwavering gaze. Her voice remained gentle. "Think very carefully before you take another step." For a moment, something unreadable flickered across Braithwaite's face. Then, in a movement so slow it seemed almost deliberate, he exhaled and let the gun slip from his fingers. Craddock snatched it up immediately, yanking Braithwaite's arms behind his back and securing the cuffs with a sharp click. Pettigrew let out a shaky breath, as if only now realizing just how close things had come to disaster. Miss Marple sighed. "You always did have an air of arrogance, Colonel. But even the most careful men make mistakes." Craddock pulled Braithwaite toward the door, his grip firm. "You can add attempted escape to your list of charges." Braithwaite's voice was steady, but there was something distant about it now. "Well played, Miss Marple." She gave a small nod. "It wasn't a game, Colonel." As Craddock led him away, Pettigrew remained frozen, his fingers twitching uselessly in his lap. He turned to Miss Marple, his face a mixture of desperation and shame. "I didn't mean— I swear I never meant—" Miss Marple regarded him with quiet understanding. "And yet, Mr. Pettigrew, intentions rarely matter when harm has already been done." Craddock returned, rubbing his temple as if warding off a headache. "He'll be processed immediately. Pettigrew, you're coming as well." Pettigrew let out a weak nod, standing shakily as the constables took hold of him. As he was led away, he cast one last glance at Miss Marple. Whether it was pleading or regret, she couldn't quite tell. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of resolution. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her fingers resting lightly on the poetry book. Miss Collins, who had been silent all this time, let out a breath she had been holding. "It's over then." Miss Marple offered her a small smile. "Yes, my dear, I do believe it is." And yet as she watched the flickering fire, the embers glowing softly in the dim room, she couldn't help but feel the faintest chill. Justice had been served, and yet, somehow, it never quite felt like enough. Miss Marple sat in the quiet drawing-room, the last echoes of the evening fading around her. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rustling the hedges as if carrying secrets only it could understand. The case was closed, the culprits in custody, and yet something still gnawed at the edge of her thoughts. Inspector Craddock had been confident in the resolution. Colonel Braithwaite and Pettigrew had been the architects of it all, using Mrs. Wills as a pawn, feeding her paranoia until she had acted in desperation. And yet, as Miss Marple traced the delicate floral embossing on the spine of her book, a quiet unease remained. Miss Collins stood near the window, arms folded across her chest. "You seem troubled." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "It's nothing, my dear. Or at least, it should be nothing." Miss Collins tilted her head slightly. "But," Miss Marple hesitated. "When we uncovered everything, Pettigrew was the one who crumbled. That much was expected. He was the weakest link, the one most likely to confess under pressure." "But Braithwaite," Miss Collins frowned. "He nearly shot Craddock." Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly against her chin. Indeed. And yet, even when caught, even when he knew the game was over, he didn't seem afraid. There was no real sense of defeat in him. Miss Collins turned to fully face her. "Some men are simply that arrogant." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, certainly. But arrogance often comes with a touch of bitterness when one is bested. Braithwaite was not bitter." Miss Collins frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple let out a quiet sigh, standing and moving toward the writing desk in the corner. The papers there had been left in disarray from the hurried searches earlier. She carefully straightened them, her fingers lingering over a single page. A letter. It was from Dr. Radcliffe, the unfortunate victim at the center of it all. A formal correspondence, nothing more than a mundane note regarding an upcoming meeting, except Miss Marple's eyes skimmed over the closing lines, the last phrase written in a hurried hand. "Something doesn't fit," Miss Marple murmured. Miss Collins stepped closer. "What is it?" Miss Marple's voice was soft. "The way she signed this letter. With urgency. E.R." Miss Collins frowned. Perhaps she was simply in a rush. Perhaps. But Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the paper. Except she always signed her letters in full. Never initials. It was something of a habit of hers. Miss Collins leaned over her shoulder, reading the words again. "Then what does that mean?" Miss Marple turned toward the fireplace, her expression distant. "It means that just before her death, Dr. Radcliffe was trying to tell someone something urgent." The flames crackled, throwing a brief burst of light across the room. Miss Collins shook her head. "But we know what happened. We know why she was killed." Miss Marple nodded absently. "Yes, we do." And yet the uneasy feeling did not leave her. Braithwaite had accepted his fate too easily. Pettigrew had been desperate. Mrs. Wills had been afraid, and yet, somewhere in all of it, there was still a missing thread. A sound at the door made them both turn. A young constable stood there, his expression uncertain. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but a message just came through." She took the small slip of paper from him, unfolding it carefully. The words were scrawled in a tight, efficient script. "You looked in the right place, but stopped too soon. Not every truth fits neatly into a confession." Miss Collins exhaled sharply. "Who sent this?" The constable hesitated. There was no name, just delivered by a messenger. Miss Marple studied the note, then looked past it, beyond the walls of the room, beyond the case they had just closed. Somewhere out there, something still didn't fit. Something still lingered in the shadows, just out of reach. She smiled, ever so faintly. A mystery never truly ended. It only waited.